Welcome to All Things Savannah, our weekly deep dive into the people, history, stories, and inside information about Savannah, Georgia, the hostess city. I'm Frank Morrow, along with Daniela Oak.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our show today. We have a great guest today, Andrew Berrien Jones. And I'm not going to go overboard on this, but Andrew is a direct descendant of Noble Jones and chairman of the Oglethorpe Plan Coalition, and as well an accomplished painter. That just tip of the iceberg for who Andrew is and what he does. So we're going to launch right into this. Andrew, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, Danielle and Frank. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I mentioned Noble Jones. Mm-hmm. So let's go way back. If you can even attach a date to this, it would help people who listen understand where this is where you're from, really.
Okay, well, certainly. Noble Jones came to Savannah with Oglethorpe in 1733 on the ship Anne. Mm-hmm. And he was a very close friend of Oglethorpe. And when he arrived in the colony, Oglethorpe gave him many, many jobs. It's hard to believe that one person could do so many different things, but he did. And he was head of a militia that protected Savannah called Jones's Rangers.
Ooh.
And Captain Jones's fort is the fort at Wormslow that still survives to this day. He also at one point was the justice of the court here. He was the agent for Tomachichi, the Indian chief. He also practiced medicine, having learned medicine from Dr. Nunez, one of the Portuguese Jewish immigrants. And there's so much else. And of course, he was surveyor. He was an architect, and those two trades were very closely related. In the ship records, he listed himself as a carpenter, but a carpenter means many things. It means a joiner, someone who puts wood together and can build. And typically in London in those periods, you would start as a carpenter and then you would build buildings and be an architect, and then surveyor was sort of an architect project manager who could also not just build a building but measure the land. So he was appointed as the surveyor for the colony. He likely had a role in the design of what's called the Oglethorpe Plan. The Oglethorpe Plan is likely the product of the London Masonic Lodge, which was founded in 1727 in the Age of Enlightenment based on principles of Isaac Newton and others. They considered God to be the architect of the universe. Architecture was key, obviously, to the Masons. And they were very interested in reviving the designs of the ancient Romans and Roman city planning, specifically the Roman architect Vitruvius. Mm-hmm. Oglethorpe is known for his sympathy towards debtors. We've all heard that. Well, partly because his close friend Robert Castell died in debtor's prison. Robert Castell had not yet published, but was translating the works of Vitruvius. So Oglethorpe had an access to an English translation, and when Oglethorpe wrote to the trustees why he chose Savannah as the location, or chose the bluff as the location for Savannah, he was quoting Vitruvius extensively. So we know that Oglethorpe had deep knowledge of those ancient architectural principles. And the Masons in particular were very interested, and there were numerous books published in that period under the title of Vitruvius Britannicus. Mm-hmm. And they often included renderings by Inigo Jones. We don't know if Inigo Jones was related to Noble Jones. Inigo Jones had no descendants, but Noble Jones did name his second son Inigo. And this earlier architect in the 1630s, specifically in 1633, designed the first planned square in London, Covent Garden. If you've seen My Fair Lady, the opening scene where Eliza Doolittle is by the big columns, those are the columns of St. Paul's Chapel. And Savannah is very likely a centennial celebration of that design of a civic square.
Boy, that's a great way of framing it.
And this is why we have Andrew on the show.
Exactly. That's just for
Because-
openers.
That's just, yes. And you are related to this gentleman. That's
I'm related to Noble Jones. We don't know if there's a connection to Inigo Jones, but,
Okay.
but I do have a portrait of him.
Ah. Now, we know that there are a lot of families whose names are prominent in this city, and you have connection to some of those families as well through marriage. So what are some of the names people who are watching might recognize that your family is connected to?
I'm descended from William Bull of Bull Street, and he was one of the trustees of the early colony. I'm descended from John Drayton, Drayton Street, who was also involved in the colony. James Habersham. Technically, Habersham Street is named after Joseph Habersham, who was the Postmaster General under Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, and was a Revolutionary War hero. Cousins of the Telfairs and the Tatnalls, and then Bryan Street is named after Joseph and John Bryan, and John Bryan was my ancestor. He was the other Chief Justice along with Noble Jones. Berrien Street, Anderson Street.
All
There are a
connected.
few others, yes.
You were born here?
No, I was born in Baltimore. My father taught at College Park, the University of Maryland.
Yeah.
So he settled there, and strangely, we actually had a number of cousins up there. You can really never get away from Savannah. It just surrounds you. I was raised in a house that was filled with Savannah portraits and Savannah furniture, books on Savannah, and my dad's stories about Savannah. But I even had second cousins in Baltimore who were Jones and Habersham descendants, and that was just sort of a fluke. There was a woman in the family, a cousin, who ended up marrying into a Maryland family, and they had a lot of children. So by the time we lived there, we suddenly had all these cousins, which was great, and they had Savannah portraits on the walls.
of course.
You didn't stay in Baltimore. You left after a period of time. Tell us about
I
where you
did.
went next.
I went to Georgetown in Washington, D.C., enjoyed that very much. And of course, I had Savannah ancestors who went to Georgetown.
Sure.
I thought so and discovered that was true. Then I went to Yale for law school. Same thing, Savannah follows you all around. I thought I was the first person in my family to go to Yale Law School. It turns out that my great-great-great-grandfather went to Yale and was an undergrad and studied law before the law school actually was incorporated.
Wow, it's hard to break new
But
ground in
no,
your family,
you can't.
isn't
It
it?
just all you end up doing is just walking in their footsteps. And then after that, I went to New York City, and
Okay.
you can't get away from Savannah there either. Now, I did eventually. I always wanted a nice Greenwich Village brownstone. And if you've ever been in one, they're just like the Savannah house. Exact same floor plan, staircase on the side, double parlor. And I eventually got one, and I bought one that reminded me of my Aunt Caroline's house in Savannah. So that was fun. And then, of course, I kept running into all sorts of other, I ran into living relatives I had never met. I ran into, at a party, Hamilton Fish, who was 99 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And he said, I know who you are.
Old politician in New
He
York.
says, I know who you are.
Wow.
When my great-grandfather was a little boy, he sat on his great-grandfather's knee, and that great-grandfather had met John Berrien. And he was a relative of the Berriens. That's why they had
Hamilton
there was-
Fish.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I had met someone who knew my ancestor. I mean, it's amazing. Only that many degrees of separation. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. So we have folks here who've moved to Savannah in, as recently as 3 months ago, and now we have Andrew, who has literally a toehold in 1733.
From the beginning, as it were.
I love it.
That's remarkable.
But in a way, my family is typical of a lot of Savannah families who lived in many other places as well. Savannans often tried to get away from the heat, live in other places, often went to schools in other places. So sometimes people come to Savannah, they think it's just a provincial town and nobody leaves Savannah and it's just Savannah. And if you start looking at the histories of people, they traveled extensively and often studied abroad or schools up north, and it was not a provincial town. It was very, very highly connected.
Sure.
Quietly cosmopolitan.
I want to remind everyone you are watching All Things Savannah. We're coming to you from the Bluff Hotel. How appropriate for this program. Where Savannah was founded, in this general vicinity. And joining us is Andrew Berrien Jones. He is someone who is a longtime Savannahian in many ways, through lineage certainly. He is the chairman of the Oglethorpe Plan Coalition, and he's an accomplished painter, but he's done so much more in his life, which we're talking about. You have a lot of passion, obviously, for Savannah for many good reasons. We have an ongoing, we'll call it a discussion right now in the community about the Savannah Civic Center, its past, its present, and its future. Tell us about the Oglethorpe Plan Coalition, their position on this, and where we're going from here.
Certainly. Well, the Oglethorpe Plan Coalition follows two basic principles, and one is to protect and preserve the Oglethorpe Plan wherever possible and practical. The second one is we also believe in the enforcement of the ordinances on the books that protect the historic district. As to the first, the natural conclusions, we would like to see the Oglethorpe Plan restored across the entire Civic Center site. That does not mean the loss of a theater. One can build a theater on many other sites. In fact, there's an open parking lot at 301 MLK, a parking lot for the Visitor Center. It's more than large enough to build a new theater. And also, it just happens that the ordinances do say that any development project must respect and restore the Oglethorpe Plan. And the city certainly refers to this as a redevelopment project. So there's certainly an argument that the ordinance intends for, in fact, the plan to be restored.
So for those of you who may not know, there were 24 squares established in 1733 by Oglethorpe. That was the plan. And we are down to 22 currently. One has, well, it's called the Lost Square. It's not really lost. We know where it is. It's underneath something. And one of the squares has our civic building on top of it, which was built in 1972, I believe.
Yes.
And what kind of architecture would you call that? International?
It was, I think, formalism. It had a name, like urban formalism or new formalism. Philip Johnson practiced it. So there are a lot of buildings with tall arches. Think of Lincoln Center.
Kind of flat.
The problem is that the Mercer Theater is just not a good example of it. You go to Oglethorpe Avenue, its main address, and you walk up the pathway and up the stairs into this grand colonnade, and there's no door.
There's no door.
Oh.
Yeah.
So as a building, it's not a good example of that period. It echoes some of the very good buildings in the forms of the arches, but that's about it.
Does that mean it doesn't have any real, in your view, historical significance to that period, so much so that it had to be preserved? Is that kind of your
It has
position?
some, but I think the weight of the 200 years of historic buildings that were before it and the important people who lived there outweighs its historic significance. And the Civic Center site was really one of the worst projects in all of Savannah's urban planning. A large portion of the city was destroyed. The houses were not saved by the city. The private money picked up the houses. Mills Lane and the Beehive funded a lot of that and moved them down to the Warren Square area to save them. If you look at the city's cultural landscape report, which is on the city's website, it's very detailed, and it'll show you all the beautiful buildings that were destroyed over time in that neighborhood. That neighborhood was once a very elegant residential area. Of course, in Savannah, you had what I call mixed income housing in the 19th century. So you would have a mansion and then a small house next to it. People didn't segregate populations by income back then. But there were some really outstanding mansions. One was the home of my great-great-grandfather, Robert Habersham, who was probably the most prominent banker in the early 19th century in Savannah. He had bought the house built by the Bullock family, a really important family with extremely important revolutionary stories. The Bullock Habersham House was William Jay's masterpiece, and William Jay, as you know, was the great architect from England who built the beautiful Regency houses like the Owens Thomas and the Telfair.
Sure.
But the Bullock Habersham was his masterpiece, and that was destroyed by the city in 1916 to build that civic auditorium. So the city has a long record of destroying buildings that are significant to Savannahans and to people outside of Savannah. At the time that the house was demolished, it had actually been a tourist site, and it was in postcards. So it was actually something people came to Savannah to see. The city decided that it had to be destroyed. There were other wonderful houses throughout the site, and again, the report goes through them in detail. My great-grandfather, Judge Meldrum, before he bought the greenhouse, now the Green Meldrum House, he lived on Elbert Square. And so there are recollections by my grandmother of when she was young, of having lived in the Elbert Square area. So that was, I think the city is trying to characterize it as not that the houses weren't worth saving or it wasn't significant. No, it was a perfectly significant part of Savannah with, as Savannah has, a variety of different structures and uses, but it was populated by people who made major contributions to Savannah, and it was historic in its own right. And in fact, some of that area, and I have to do more research for the exact boundaries, but there was actually a town there called Ewingsburg before.
Where the Civic Center is?
Yes, before the Oglethorpe plant was laid out.
Ah,
So my ancestor, John Berrien, the
something I never
Revolutionary
knew.
War hero,
Yes.
whose house I live in now,
Yes.
he actually had lived in Ewingsburg before then. And I guess the city announced to everybody that they were going to expand the plan, and so Ewingsburg disappeared.
Wow. All right, so we want to get to your grandfather's house. We want to get to the Berrien house. But I also want to, before we leave the Civic Center issue, we want to mention a couple of things. First of all, as we record this, the Historic Savannah Foundation, just a couple of days ago, came out with a position that basically said they support returning Elbert Square to its original design, as you are so in favor of. And then there's that issue about the Johnny Mercer Theater, which is, are we losing an important place to have performing arts, and what could be done about that? So the city, if I understand their position correctly, would like to restore the Johnny Mercer Theater if that's doable. I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure they know yet if it is. But the Historic Savannah Foundation came out with something interesting that said, if you're going to remove the I-16 flyover, which is now in process, who knows when that's going to happen, that there might be a way to relocate and build a new theater to the specs of the Johnny Mercer Theater on that site. If I've got that right, do you think that's a smart thing to do? Do you agree with something like that? With that?
Well, not speaking officially as the OPC, the OPC's view is broader that there are sites that are great locations for the theater. Some of us individually are identifying sites. As I said, the 301 MLK site is ready to build right now. The I-16 flyover will involve a lot of steps, procedural steps, before a decision is made and designs are finalized.
It's going to take a while.
It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
So it would seem more logical to choose the site that's ready, as opposed to one that has so many hurdles. But the I-16 is interesting. There are many historic structures over there. That is the site of the Siege of Savannah battlefield.
Previous terminal, railroad terminal right there too.
Yes,
Demolished.
and the 18th century Jewish cemeteries are there. So there's a lot of historic resources there that need to be taken into account. And of course, even at the 301 MLK site, which is city-owned, because it's city-owned, they would need to do archaeology.
Yeah.
But at least the parcel exists as a parcel, and it's probably a little less complicated. But there are other sites we've identified as well. So if neither of those work out, I think we have at least 3 others that look.
So the theater doesn't have to stay where it is necessarily.
We don't believe so. As the OPC, we believe it can go somewhere else, and certainly it can remain in existence. It can stand while all the other work is being done. No one needs to lose anything in this process.
Right. So here we go. This is a good window into what we are looking at as Savannahans and what matters to us. Because what matters to us in this area is, of course, what brings people to the area from outside. So it's all core. It's it all matters. So thank you for shedding some light on that.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate that.
You are watching All Things Savannah. We're coming to you from the Bluff Hotel, 630 West Bay Street, historic district downtown Savannah. Andrew Berrien Jones is with us, longtime family member of a very long-time family.
Yes.
And he is active now. That's an important thing. So, you know, some people come from families. The families come and go. There's a disconnect in some cases. You're still very connected to the city of Savannah. You feel very strongly about it. And that's really, I think, a very important thing.
Yeah, love that. Now, I mean, this is a best-kept secret. I'm not sure whether I could actually call it that. But Andrew is a very talented painter, and I just found this out very recently. Very prolific as well. Many, many canvases. But what I love about you, or what you focus on with your painting, is not, it's landscape and architecture. And
Exactly.
I love that's part and parcel of who you are, Andrew.
Makes sense.
So tell us about your art training. Do you have formal training, or?
I don't have formal training. My mother was a painter with formal training. She didn't train me, but she always provided helpful critique. But she just let me go do my own thing. But she taught me a lot of interesting tricks, compositionally. If you want to test a painting, turn it upside down. If it's got a really strong composition, it'll work as an abstract painting upside down. It helps you remove yourself from what you've painted and look at it with fresh eyes. I grew up in a home filled with art books, filled with art. It was just considered a normal thing to do and to create. And I started, I asked my parents if I could start painting at the age of 8. And they said that you're too young and you're going to have to wait until you're 12.
Oh.
And that's 4 years. That was half of my life.
That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So I thought, well, Andrew, you're not going to win this one right now. But maybe if you ask this next year, they'll forget what they said. So I asked them when I was 9 years old, can I paint? And they said yes. And they set me up. And we had, in our summer house, we had a laundry room, but it was big enough to set up an easel. And I just
Your
basically
studio.
started painting away and selling paintings by the age of 14 and having gallery shows at the age of 17 and 18.
That's impressive.
That was my beer money in college.
Probably best gone to that anyway.
Well, you've got some wonderful pieces, and you focus a lot on architecture, as I said, specifically ironworks. So cast iron,
Cast iron railings and
railings.
having spent, I was in New York for 35 years, the New York has wonderful examples of cast iron,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of communication artistically, obviously among all the cities on the East Coast, and even all the way through down to South America. You see many of the same iron patterns repeating. In Savannah, there are multiple iron patterns that are identical to ones in New York. I suspect they were probably imported from New York, or at
Okay.
least the patterns were. If they, maybe they were manufactured here. I mean, an example: the Harper Folks House. The iron pattern around there is a pattern that is of the time. It's a squared medallion at the base and a little Greek key design, and that is very typical in New York, 1844 to 1846. In New York, they were very concerned about fashion, and you changed your clothes with the fashions, and you changed your address with the fashions, and your ironwork had to be
your
of the
railings.
moment.
Right down
Because
to
in
the railings,
1847, the style changed, and in 1851, it changed again. So you can actually, in New York, because it's so precise, you can actually walk down the street, look at a building, look at the ironwork, look at the brick patterns, and identify when it was built, typically to within about a 3-year level. So once there was a reporter at the New York Times, and I've forgotten his name, but he sent me about half dozen pictures of stoops and said, I want you to date them.
Huh, that's
Oh.
flattering,
And
I
Of
suppose,
course, you
too.
rose to the
And
challenge.
I rose to the
Of course.
challenge. I got 2 of them on the exact year of construction.
Wow.
I think 2 of them I was a year off, and then the other 2 I was maybe about 4 years off. I should have picked up some clues. I just,
Who
I
could have
missed
done it,
them.
though,
But-
really, when you think about
And
it?
then he said, I need to join your religion. Savannah's harder because once a style is popular down here, people didn't give it up.
Right, so it lasts
So
a lot
it
longer,
lasts a
right?
lot
Yeah.
longer.
Yeah. You have your resume for painting, I think, is posted somewhere. We both looked at it. I couldn't get through it because there's so much
Yeah.
there. Hazard a guess out of how many paintings you've done
How many
in your
canvases,
lifetime. How many
yeah.
canvases have you done, do you think?
Well, I tend to start a lot.
Okay.
I guess that's artistry, though, isn't that
I
the
start a
profession?
lot, and then actually finishing them is much harder.
Okay.
But I'm sure since I've been painting since I was 8. I mean, it is in the hundreds. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we'll put the link below.
Okay,
In
wonderful.
the info
Yes.
box, so people can take a look at your work.
Really should see your stuff, yeah.
The last thing I want to talk about before we close, though, is your amazing house. It's amazing because it's a beautiful historic site. It's been beautifully cared for by you and restored by you, including lifting the building
Right.
itself
It's remarkable.
to its original grade, which is, I don't really even know how that was done. Can't imagine.
Doesn't sound easy, though,
I've
does
had
it?
the joy of being in his home, and it is exquisite. Andrew's collection of furniture is just beautiful. So
Thank
could
you.
Could you tell us a little bit about your place?
Okay. Well, many people ask first, how did you come across it? And I was visiting my uncle Noble Jones, who lived on State Street, just off of Habersham, and I was with my father, and we had just visited Uncle Noble, and we decided to walk down Habersham towards Broughton, and I looked up and I saw this weird-looking building, and but it looked like it was an 18th century house, but up on stilts, and I pointed it out to my dad, and I said, look, that's an 18th century building under there. And I was prone to be imaginative, but he agreed. But he didn't know whose house it was.
Really?
And it wasn't until many years later, when I was looking at real estate, I looked through the survey from the late 60s of all the buildings in Savannah, and there it said the John Berrien house.
That must have been quite a revelation
Well,
right there.
It was a real shocker. And a friend of mine, Emery Jarrett, was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, and a real estate broker. I went to him, I said, Emery, is this really the John Berrien house? He said, oh, absolutely. And I said, can we get inside it? And he said, well, it's privately owned right now, and it's not for sale. And then he said, but Andrew, you know what? Everything's for sale. I think I know where I can get the keys. And so we went into the house in its original ruined state. There were holes in the floor, and it was a rainy day, and the water was pouring through, and the house had been cut up into tenements, and so every room was divided into 3 or 4 rooms. And we walked into one room, and all of a sudden there's this incredible wainscoting and beautiful 18th century millwork and this incredible cornice on one wall. And then we walked through the door, and there was some more of it. And then we walked through the door of the next little room, and there was more. And then we realized what we had discovered. The house, there was always a legend that the Berrien house had a ballroom. Now, we don't mean a ballroom in the size of the Gilded Age ballroom.
Sure.
But they used to have upstairs parlors that were large enough for dancing. So basically the equivalent of a big parlor in a hallway turned into a single room. And that's what we had discovered. That was the most important room in the house, and it was actually up on what looks like the 3rd floor. And then I thought, this is amazing. I mean, Savannah has such an old memory, because we realized that the first time that room was divided up was when it was divided up into bedrooms, probably around 1820.
Really?
So it means that people in Savannah knew there was a ballroom in the house, but the only way they knew there was a ballroom in the house was having a memory that went back before 1820. It was never written down. So this is folklore passed down verbally from person to person.
Which is how a lot of history around here gets told.
But it was shocking that the story was true, and that was a thrill. And then many years later, the house turned up as a foreclosure property, and at that point, I thought, well, someone's going to buy it, And if it's not me, then they might not do good things with it, so.
And what year was that?
That was 2012.
Oh,
So
okay.
not all that long
No,
ago,
no.
really.
No, and then I did research on the house, thought it did look a little odd being up so high. And what had happened was the 18th century house had a typical Savannah ground floor of roughly 8 or 9 feet. And in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, one form of preservation was, instead of demolishing a building, if you wanted to put a commercial storefront on the ground floor, just lift the building up.
Just like that.
Lift it up, and then you can have
Right.
a 12-foot ceiling. So that's what they did there. And a number of buildings on Broughton Street that no longer exist that were where they did the same thing, and not just in Savannah. Other
Yeah.
cities did that too. So an early form of historic preservation. You don't demolish it. You just
Make retail
sort of
out of
ignore
the
it,
stick
stick it up in the
floors.
sky, and
Yeah.
just pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
And so what we did in the restoration was on the basis of photographs that were taken before that.
Okay.
We took the building and lifted it off that circa 1916 ground floor, which really was not worth saving, and then removed that and rebuilt from the old photographs what the original ground floor looked like,
That's-
and then lowered the house onto that. And then all of a sudden, all the proportions of the house made perfect sense.
Right.
It all became very, very logical.
Yeah.
How long does a project like that take? Tell me.
It was in 2 stages, surprisingly very fast. So the first stage was the structural work and the foundation and the first floor, and then restoring the entire exterior of the building. That was really only about 9 months. It was
That's
surprisingly
incredible.
fast.
Yeah, it seems like it.
And then we took a break because we had this house that was an 18th century house where you could go inside and see all the original beams and what they call the marriage marks, the numbers that are carved into the beams in advance. They know that number 10 goes with number 10.
Oh, sure.
And it's all mortise and
Okay.
tenon, and there are these huge pegs in the roof.
like putting it all together.
Yeah, and you could see it. And there were 50 layers of 18th through late 19th century wallpaper patterns.
Oh,
That's
One of them was copied for the Davenport house. So if you go into the Davenport house,
Yeah.
the hallway, that's one of the houses, one of the patterns from the
Beautiful
Berrien
pattern.
house. And then Mount Vernon commissioned a copy of a pattern that they've used in one of the upstairs bedrooms. So in a way, I wanted to leave the house like that because it was just so interesting. It's so tactile. But you can't really, because I did need to live there.
yes.
And so then after about 2 years of it being in that state, and at least 2,000 people coming through the house to look at it,
Yeah.
I embarked on the next renovation, which was the interior, and that was about a year.
That's still pretty
Yeah, it was
incredible,
pretty
given
fast.
the age, given the circumstances.
And there was
Lot to
in
do.
between, there was a lot of design work and research and
Yeah.
architectural drafting.
And then you've got an incredible collection of furniture as well.
Yes, I've been collecting furniture since I was 12.
Oh my! You are something else, boy. That is amazing, amazing. I don't know where you find time to
Andrew, you
sleep.
really need to write a book about your house. Have you ever considered that?
Yes, I've thought about that.
Okay.
There's so many angles on the house. There's the construction aspect of restoring it. There's the architectural significance and how it ties into pattern books from the 18th century. There's the history of all the people who lived in the building.
Right.
It's a very rich history. So John Berrien was a Revolutionary War hero. He was appointed by George Washington as the inspector of the port. His son was a famous Georgia senator, friends with Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, ran for president and used the house as his campaign headquarters in Savannah.
Wow.
So it has national significance.
Sure does.
In between the two Berriens, when John Berrien, the war hero, became treasurer of Georgia and moved to Louisville, he sold the house to William Stevens, the son of the original William Stevens, who was part of the original colony and lived at Bewley Plantation.
Okay.
And William Stevens Jr. was mayor of Savannah, and he was, I believe, a judge. He was the head. He united all the Masonic lodges in Georgia.
So the house is
So
a who's who.
It's an interesting one. The
Yeah.
one curious thing is that I believe John Berrien was the head of Solomon's Lodge, and then William Stevens is the head of Solomon's Lodge, and then the head of all the Georgia Masons. I believe John Ferris and Berrien had either had one or both of those positions. So it seems as though you had to be really high level in the Masons to live in the house, which is kind of, I can't quite figure out why that's the case. We did find carved in the lintel over the front door the numbers 33. And some people say that that is an allusion to the 33rd degree of Masonry.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we can't, we have these interesting little dots, haven't quite connected them all
There may
together.
be more than one book in the history of the house.
And I would read every one of them, let me tell you.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
very
it'd be a
interesting.
great addition, too, of what we know about Savannah.
Yeah.
We've got stacks of books about, I think we need a book by you
That sounds right.
on Savannah.
Sounds right.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Appreciate you coming by.
My pleasure. Thank you for having
For
me.
hours more,
We
for
could,
sure.
in fact. We'll have to have you back. When you write the book, we'll have to have you back.
Absolutely.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
Thank you again. We are here, of course, next week. We want to thank the tech team again because behind the scenes they did a lot of work again today to try to keep the sound good. We're hoping it's working for you. That is Riley Sandifer and Maria Oliver. And we'll be back next time around with another deep dive into the people, history, and stories of the hostess city, Savannah, Georgia. Hope you join us.
Thank you.